Welcome to Blitz Interviews. Like the game of chess, it's only lasts 10 minutes. I'm happy to have here Josh. He has a very interesting job. He's working for Israel Embassy in Washington. And Josh, can you please tell us what do you do there?
Sure. So I'm what's called a trade officer, involved in trade promotion, representing Israeli companies in the U.S., particularly in the D.C. area. I do a number of sectors, but probably the one I've spent the most on is cybersecurity. So the idea is to kind of come up with creative ways to connect the Israeli cyber ecosystem with potential U.S. customers, partners, investors, et cetera. So at a high level, that's kind of what we're doing.
So my interviews are usually focused on cyber. So we're probably going to talk about cyber more. Mm-hmm. And I guess my first question, even so I'm Israeli, is it true that pretty much every second person in Israel has a cybersecurity company?
It does seem like that. And if not a cybersecurity company, then some kind of startup. I've never met anyone who isn't either in a startup, wanting to do a startup, an investor in a startup, doing a startup as a side. And yes, a lot of those startups are Israeli, cyber startups. It's amazing. For a country that small of barely 9 million people, there's approximately 600 to 700 Israeli cyber companies. So it's pretty amazing. So it can feel that way at times.
Now, your job is to help such companies and promote them in the United States and North America,
right?
And vice versa. You also have end user customers to find companies to answer a particular need, correct?
That's correct, right.
Can you elaborate a bit more about how you help the companies and how you help the end users?
Yeah, I mean, so it's kind of come from a variety of ways. We're essentially for context purposes, certainly for any Americans listening, our organization is we're part of the Foreign Trade Administration of the Israeli Ministry of Economy. It's the equivalent of the Commerce Department here in the U.S., and there's an International Trade Administration, and we're the exact same thing, except instead of ITA, we're the FTA. So we try to come up with kind of creative ways. We do it through, a series, usually a variety of events. Certainly before COVID, we did a lot of in-person events, road shows where, 6, 8, 10 Israeli companies would come, kind of to the U.S. and there's 4 commercial missions in the U.S. and they would set meetings, we were trying to get them meetings or participating in panels or informational sessions in the area. There's U.S. trade shows. Israel has historically had a booth at an Israel pavilion at RSA with anywhere from 20 to, actually in 2019, it was over 50 Israeli cyber firms exhibiting. And then delegations to Israel. Before COVID, I took like 2 or 3 different cyber delegations to Israel for various conferences out there. The 2 big ones are Cyber Tech and Cyber Week. So you try and find creative ways, or just establish a relationship with someone, and if they have a need in a particular area, you hope they would consider Israel and say, hey, can you recommend any good Israeli cyber firms in kind of X, Y, Z? And so for the consumers, for the foreigners, the Americans or the British or wherever they are, we have like 45 commercial missions around the world. The advantage is a relationship that allows them easy access to Israeli cyber, right? Without having to do tons of research, on their own. It's certainly difficult, I think, to keep track of the the entire cyber industry, and probably even more so, what's coming out of Israel, if you're sitting here in the U.S., right? And there's only so much time that you have. So it's easy if you have a relationship with someone in the commercial mission to turn to them, and ask them if they can recommend, cyber startups in a particular area, right? Or if you've ever thought about going to Israel, but maybe you don't want to just fly out there and hope for the best at a trade show. I have delegations where we have really customized agendas over 3 days that really gives you a deep dive into the Israeli cyber ecosystem, and not just companies, but government and university. So people will feel better about being part of a delegation of their fellow American, North American, British, whatever the case may be, colleagues, fellow cyber professionals. So the consumers, I think, also benefit from it as well.
With so many different companies in Israel right now, is this becoming harder to find the correct companies that the customer need, or how do you even know where to find? Because
sure, no one, not me or I think anyone, can really know all of the 500, 600, 700 cyber firms out of Israel, right? So it's not possible. There is a database that I would recommend to people. It's called Startup Nation Finder. There's a well-known organization in Israel called big nonprofit called Startup Nation Central, which promotes Israeli startup scene in the broader world, and they have a very nice database they created called Startup Nation Finder. If any of your guests want to Google that, where you can screen for something like 7,000 Israeli companies. So you can screen for cybersecurity, for example, cybersecurity, cloud, and then maybe by the range, and what'll come up is all cyber firms, that have been formed since 2008 and are in the seed or Series A range, right? So you end up getting some relevant results, right? So there are tools that people can use, Americans and other foreigners can use, but it's difficult to keep track of everything, right? So the idea is to look for different ways to provide people a snapshot of the Israeli cyber kind of cyber industry and cyber ecosystem. And I mean, look, it's at a certain point, there are like maybe 40 or 50 cloud startups in Israel. I mean, it can be hard to, there can be times where it can be hard to tell them apart. I think even CISOs will tell you that there are so many cyber startups out there, not just Israeli, but obviously several thousand in the US. I think if you ask a lot of CISOs, they'll tell you honestly, they can't always tell the difference either between all of them. So there's nothing foolproof, but it's kind of a way to, we do offer a way to kind of segment the market and to give people like a broader snapshot.
You've been doing this for quite a while. From your perspective, on what do you see? Why certain vendors will fail?
Well, there's a number of reasons, right? I've been doing it for 3 years, that's not as long as some, but I have developed, I would say, a perspective. And if you're talking specifically about Israel, the big challenge is, right, Israel is a tiny market, right? So how do you make the jump in? For any Israeli startup you ask, cyber or otherwise, if you ask them, what do they see as their primary market? Almost all of them will say the US. I mean, they're interested in Europe as well, but ultimately their dream is to be successful in the US, right? So the biggest challenge is once you kind of reach a certain stage, right? 5, 6, 8, 10 people, you've done, you got a few POCs, maybe you learned that an Israeli customer, the market's only so big. You're going to outgrow it really, really quickly. So the key is, how do you move and make that transition to the US, right? And a lot of it comes down to finding the right people, having the right message and product positioning. And a lot of times it also, as with any US startup as well, it comes down in a lot of cases to the CEO, right? There are a lot of really impressive, I think, young Israeli cyber CEOs, across, not just cyber, but in tech as well. And but the ones who do best are the ones that aren't kind of know-it-alls, that are open to advice and and coaching and kind of keep an open mind. And you sort of have to make the cultural transition, right? Israelis are very direct and blunt, and that's something I actually like about working with Israelis. I like that characteristic. I appreciate their blunt honesty. I like the way that they're aggressive and try and solve problems or get around issues, but you kind of have to tone the Israeliness down a bit.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you very much for being here. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.